2 Samuel 14. We're more than halfway through 2 Samuel now. We've been going through this book. Boy, well, we did I think we started about a year ago with 1 Samuel, and then we worked through that, took a little break in there, but then started into 2 Samuel. So we're actually getting to the close, believe it or not, of 2 Samuel. Just kind of looking at where we're going to be going in the coming weeks. Probably won't hit every chapter between now and the end of the book, but we're going to try to hit still the main points in David's life and as he rules as king. We're skipping over a little bit of chapter 13. If you remember from last week, we looked at a really ugly story, actually. It's a violent assault between a brother and his half-sister. And what we don't look at is that Amnon was the one that committed that assault. He is actually killed by his half-brother Absalom. We're not looking at that story, but you need to know that, I think, for background. And then Absalom is forced to kind of run for his life. And so that's where we pick up the story. Absalom is in exile, and now we pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 14, and it's on page 492 if you're using the Pew Bible. And we will read. We'll read. Oh, I wrote it down. I forget where it was. Hang on one second. Oh. Yeah, we'll read the whole chapter. It is kind of long, and I thought at one point I'd marked down a spot where we were going to stop, but I think we'll just read the whole chapter. Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, "Pretend you are in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him." And Joab put the words in her mouth. When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor, and she said, "Oh, help me, O king." And the king asked her, "What is troubling you?" She said, "I am indeed a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons, and they got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well.' They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth." The king said to the woman, "Go home, and I will issue an order in your behalf." But the woman from Tekoa said to him, "My lord the king, let the blame rest on me and on my father's family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt." The king replied, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he will not bother you again." She said, "Then let the king invoke the Lord his God to prevent the anger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed." "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground." Then the woman said, "Let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." "Speak," he replied. The woman said, "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him. And now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he will do what his servant asks. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who is trying to cut off both me and my son from the inheritance God gave us. And now your servant says, may the word of my lord the king bring me rest, for my lord the king is like an angel of God in discerning good and evil. May the Lord your God be with you." Then the king said to the woman, "Do not keep the answer to what I'm going to ask you." "Let my lord speak," the woman said. The king asked, "Isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this?" The woman answered, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this, and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything that happens in the land. The king said to Joab, Very well, I will do it. Go, bring back the young man Absalom. Joab fell with his face to the ground to pay him honor, and he blessed the king. Joab said, Today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes, my lord the king, because the king granted his servant's request. Then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king said, He must go to his own house. He must not see my face. So Absalom went to his own house, and he did not see the face of the king. In all Israel there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair from time to time when it became too heavy for him, he would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. 3 sons and a daughter were born to Absalom. The daughter's name was Tamar, and she became a beautiful woman. Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. So he sent a second time, but he refused to come. Then he said to his servants, Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house and said to him, Why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom said to Joab, Look, I sent word to you and said, Come here and I can send you to the king to ask, Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. This is the word of the Lord. Well, brothers and sisters, I heard a story a couple of weeks ago, read it in the news, I guess. A young woman living in Australia, but was, I think, from either Malaysia or Singapore or something like that. But anyways, she was in Australia, and one day she went and checked her bank balance online, checked in, and lo and behold, the bank had made some kind of a mistake. They accidentally deposited into her account something like $4.8 million. So it's kind of like that Monopoly, right? You know, bank error in your favor. Only this time it wasn't $200, it was like $4.8 million. Well, I think you and I know what you ought to do if that ever happens to you. You ought to right away talk to the bank manager and give the money back. But this woman didn't do that. She went shopping and shopping and shopping, and she spent, by the time she was all done, she spent around $3.6 million. She bought an apartment overlooking the ocean. She bought handbags and more handbags and more handbags. A ridiculous amount of money spent on these handbags. And by the time all was said and done, it was $3.6 million. And then the bank came calling. Took them about a year to trace back where the money had, how it had, gotten down to this woman. And the bank said, well, we want our money back. And she said, well, it's too late. I already spent it. And the bank said, well, we'll see about that. And they actually put her in jail. Well, this woman then had to make a very uncomfortable phone call to her parents back home. And they explained the whole situation. And I don't know what you do if your kids called you up and said that they had done that. I know what my parents would have done. This woman's parents, she was very fortunate. This woman's parents actually paid the money. They reimbursed the bank $4 million or whatever it was that she had still had to pay back the bank, so that she could at least get out of jail. And the charges were then dropped, I would assume. And I got to thinking about that, and again, so you've got your parents, and you're stuck in this position where, to do justice would be to say to your child, well, I'm sorry about that. You made your bed, now you've got to sleep in it, right? That's justice. On the other hand, you're a parent, and you love your kid, and you don't want to see them waste away in a jail cell somewhere. And so mercy is about saying, well, okay, don't do it again, we'll pay it this time. Justice or mercy, and in this case, mercy wins the day, right? Got to thinking about that a little bit as we look at this story. Now, I know this is a long story, and I'm sure if you're like me, the first time you read through it, you're scratching your head wondering what in the world is going on here. This is a story about justice and mercy. And what do? Which wins the day? Is it more important to do justice, or is it more important to show mercy? That's what this story all boils down to. In the beginning of the story, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Absalom, David's son, is in exile. And he's in exile because he murdered one of David's other sons, Amnon. He sort of took vigilante justice. He knew that his half-brother had committed this horrible crime against their half-sister, and Absalom was so outraged by this that he went and took matters into his own hand and killed his half-brother, Amnon. Well, we might look at that and we might sort of understand what would prompt a person to do that, but in Old Testament Israel, and of course even today, there's still a price to be paid for murder. And in this case, the price for murder was death, a life for a life. And so Absalom has a death sentence over his head. So what does he do? He flees. He gets out of Israel. He has to leave the palace behind. He has to leave his home behind, and he has to become an exile in this little place called Geshur. And that's where we end the story in chapter 13, and that's where we begin in chapter 14. One of the things that this right away shows us is sort of the nature of sin. If we ever were inclined to see sin as just behavior, as though it's just breaking a rule, this story actually helps us see that it is also about tearing apart relationship. Right? Absalom's offense, his crime against his brother, wasn't just, okay, Absalom, you broke commandment number 6. No, Absalom has torn apart his family. If you've ever been in a case like that, maybe you lend your kid money. They promise that they'll pay it back, and then they don't. And you're stuck in that position where it's not just that they've stolen from you now, but they've violated the trust. They've damaged that relationship. And the question is, how do you put that back together again? Or, in a marriage, your husband, your wife, in the heat of the moment, just says something that they know is going to go after your soft underbelly, right? They say something that just really hurts. You could look at that and say, well, you've just broken a rule. Yeah, but you also know that you've torn apart the relationship. And how do you rebuild it? How do you put the relationship back together again? That's the tension in this story here. All of chapter 14 centers on the question, how is David going to repair this relationship with his estranged son Absalom? On the one hand, David he's a father. You read in chapter 14, verse 1, and the king's heart longed for Absalom. The king knows that his son has done something terribly wrong, and yet he's a father. He wants his son to come back home again. Right? I mean, as a parent, no matter what your kids do, there's a part of you that longs for them. You just want them to come home again. But you notice also that the emphasis is also on David's position as a king, right? In fact, David is not even named in this passage, I don't think. If he is, it's maybe 1 or 2 times at most. But time and again we read, it's the king, the king, the king, right? You notice that as we were reading it through, and that's to put a focus or an emphasis on David's position and his role and his responsibility. As a king, he can't just overlook justice. He can't just say in his kingdom, well, we can let some things like that slide. No, the king has a responsibility to maintain justice in the kingdom. So David is in this position of both father and a king. What is he going to do? Will the father heart of mercy win out, or will the king heart of justice win out? That's where the tension centers in this story. How will David be reconciled to his son? How will he put this relationship with his son back together again? Well, Joab is one of the king's officers. He's one of the high-ranking officials for David, and he sees the pain and the frustration that the king has, and so he comes up with a plan. Now, it's really important, I think, to notice that this is the second time that a storyteller comes to David, right? You remember the first time after David's sin with Bathsheba, it's Nathan the prophet that comes and tells David this story, and it was a fictional story, but it was a way to get David's attention. And we're seeing that happen again. Joab finds this woman in a little town called Tekoa and says to her, I need you to go to the king, and I need you to pretend that you have a problem. And Joab gives this woman the whole story to tell. And it's important, I think, to realize that this wasn't about being deceptive. It's more about telling the story or telling the truth in a way that it can be heard. And so this woman, and Joab working with this woman, tells King David a story so that David can hear the truth in a way that he will grasp it. A lot of this text centers on the story that the woman tells, and this is probably where it became a little hard to follow the story, right? It was for me. I had to go back and read it and reread it probably 3 or 4 times before I could even figure out what's really happening. But in essence, it boils down to this. This woman goes to the king and says, here's my problem. I had 2 sons. They got into a fight in the field, and there was no one else around to kind of cool them down. And one of them, in a moment of anger, killed the other son. Now, the woman goes on, the rest of my clan, the rest of my family wants justice to be done. They want the son who killed his brother to face the death penalty, right? Justice. We've got to do the right thing here. We've got to follow the law. But the woman says, there's a problem here. If you kill my son, if you put him to death according to the law, then I'm not going to have an heir anymore. It'll just be me. There'll be no one to take care of me. I don't have any other children. So the woman says, I want you to show mercy to my son. I want you to tell everyone else to keep their hands off of my son. So the woman's story, the woman's dilemma boils down to this, and you'll begin to now see the parallels, I think. The woman is saying, is it more important to do justice at the expense of the family? Punish the son, and that's going to destroy the family. Or is it better to show mercy in order to save the family, even if that comes at the expense of justice? So do you see the dilemma that this woman is presenting? She's telling a story. None of this ever actually happened. It's all a story, but she's presenting the dilemma to David. Which do you do, justice or mercy? Doing justice is going to mean that the family eventually falls apart. This widow's going to lose her livelihood and her future is over. But at least justice will be done. Showing mercy will mean this woman gets her son back. She has someone to take care of her, but it's going to look like justice has been compromised. So David hears this whole story in verses 5 through 7, and then in verses 10 through 11, David does a couple of things. Well, keep in mind first, the king has the responsibility, he plays the role of like Supreme Court justice in the land. So when David speaks, and when he declares a verdict in this story, or when he makes a ruling in this story, then that would have been understood as binding on the law, but it also would have been binding on himself, right? Because David doesn't know it yet, but this story is really about him. So David's about to issue this ruling, thinking it's about this woman, but it turns out he's really issuing a ruling on himself. And he takes an oath. He makes an oath there in verse 11, as surely as the Lord lives. So he's swearing by God's authority that this is the truth, that this is what must be done. That's what he says in verse 11. And then his ruling or his decision is that mercy must prevail. When David hears this woman's story, he says, your family has to show mercy. In fact, he says, not a hair will fall from his head. And I will issue that as a ruling. No one is to harm your son. Right? That's in verses 8 and then 10 and 11. No one's going to bother you, or no one's going to kill your son, is what David says. So David shows mercy. Now the question is that what it takes to put the whole relationship back between David and his son? Should David just go easy on Absalom? Should he just say, Absalom, come on now, come home, let's show you kindness, right? That sounds appealing. That sounds like a good way to go. When we hear this woman's story and we hear what this woman asks, it sounds very good. But here are the limits. Here's the problem with just showing mercy. Because there is a problem, and we begin to see it in this text. When David says to this woman, not a hair will fall from your son's head, there's a foreshadowing going on there, right? Again, David thinks he's talking about this woman's sons, but since they're fictional, David's really talking about himself, and he just doesn't know it yet. What the author is doing is foreshadowing the limits of David's power, right? David's saying, show mercy, show kindness, and not a hair will fall from his head. But David is really overreaching here. David is a king, and yet he's making this promise to show mercy, but can he really guarantee that level of protection to anyone? Right? Can he really make that kind of a promise? Sounds very good. It sounds very kind and benevolent and generous. The irony is, Absalom, when we realize this is a story about David and his son Absalom, right? Absalom's hair actually plays a very significant part in the rest of the story. So the narrator is setting us up here to see that. Show mercy to your son Absalom. Show kindness to him. Right? Not a hair will fall from his head. Well, in the end, it turns out that it was Absalom's hair that actually led to his death. You go back, we'll get to that in chapter 18, but Absalom, it was his hair that led him to actually be caught up in a tree and to be suffocated, a horrible way to die. But the point is, as the narrator tells this story, he's making David look to be very generous. Not a hair will fall from his head, but it turns out that's more than David can really promise. But more importantly, David is ignoring justice here. Right? When David begins to show mercy to his son Absalom, he doesn't realize that he's setting justice aside, and there are repercussions for that. I'll try to show you what I mean by that. In verses 14 to 16, this woman speaks up again, and she says something very significant. She says, like water spilled on the ground which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him. What is this woman saying? Well, essentially she's saying this. God wants us to be reconciled. He wants us to do whatever we can to fix and to repair broken relationships. Now, on the one hand, that's true, and that sounds very good. It sounds very appealing, right? God just wants us to kind of come back together again, and he wants us to be reconciled with those that we've been estranged with. That's all very good. That's all very important. That's all biblical. The problem is when the woman tells this story, she is, in her story, and then David later on in real life, is setting aside the demands of justice. Can you have reconciliation with those who have hurt you if you ignore justice? Can you come back together with someone who has hurt you if you ignore what they have done wrong to hurt you in the first place? Can David bring Absalom back into his home and say, Absalom, let's just forget about that murder that you committed against your half-brother? Right? Can you have reconciliation that this woman is talking about and all the while ignore the demands of justice? That's the question here. We begin to see that this, on the surface, it sounds very good, right? Bring Absalom home, but we begin to see the problem here. Joab goes out after the woman reveals, okay, this was actually a story. Joab put me up to it, and David begins to see that this whole story was really about him, and David then is convicted. He realizes, okay, if I'm going to pronounce mercy on this woman's son, and if I'm going to say that mercy has to win the day, then I guess I need to do that in my own family. That's essentially how this works out. So then Joab goes out to where Absalom lived in this little town where he was in exile and says, guess what? The king has changed his mind. The king says you can come home, but you are not to enter the palace just yet. You can come home, you can come back to Jerusalem, but you can't see the king's face. So it's kind of like partial reconciliation. It's like David is caught in the middle yet. He wants to bring his son home, he wants to be merciful, but he still knows there's that whole offense that he has to deal with, so he's not ready to have Absalom come home all the way yet. Well, that works for a little while, actually, but Absalom still wants full reconciliation. He still wants to be back in the king's presence again. So there's that little scene there in verses 28 through 30, 31, where Absalom tries to get a hold of Joab. He wants to say, hey, Joab, I'm ready to go back to the king's palace. What can we do to make that happen? And it's like Joab isn't picking up his phone. And so Absalom finally says, well, let's burn down the guy's field. That'll get his attention. And that's exactly what happens. Absalom goes out, burns down Joab's field, and finally Joab says, hey, why did you do that for? And Absalom says, well, I tried to call you, but you didn't answer, and I figured this would get your attention. And so Joab says, well, you have my attention now. And at that point, Absalom says, listen, I want to be back in the king's palace. I want full reconciliation with my father, the king. And so Joab goes back to David and says, hey, your son still wants to come all the way home. And David says, okay. He brings Absalom all the way back to the palace. This is supposed to be a picture of full reconciliation. This is supposed to be a picture of the king and his son fully restored to each other. The story ends in verse 33 with the king kissing Absalom. It's a royal greeting, but it's a greeting that signifies restoration and reconciliation. And so you'd look at this story and say, okay, they begin the story, they're estranged, the family is torn apart, and we end the story and they're about as reconciled as you can get, at least on the surface. But again, the question is, where is justice in this story? Where has David dealt with the sin of his son? And the answer is he hasn't. And so the truth of the matter is that although this story looks like it has a somewhat happy ending, it's all superficial. There's been no repentance. There's been no change of heart in Absalom. Justice, justice has never been done yet. In the next chapter, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves now, but in the next chapter, I'll just show you that chapter 14 ends with foreshadowing. The king gives his son, David gives his son the kiss of reconciliation. But in chapter 15, by about verse 4 or 5, Absalom goes and he's having the subjects of the kingdom kiss his hand. In other words, the kiss of reconciliation that David extends to Absalom becomes a kiss of betrayal. Because Absalom goes out and he's beginning to sow the seeds of rebellion in the kingdom. And so the narrator is preparing us for that. What looks like the kiss of reconciliation soon will turn into a kiss of betrayal. How do we make sense of all this story for us today? What is this? I mean, it's a fascinating story. It might make a great movie if you could find a way to portray this all. What's the point? Well, I got to thinking about that, and it occurs to me that, on the one hand, we want the picture of mercy, right? We want David, who kind of comes to this story, and you could say, well, it's good that David sort of learns to soften up a little bit. I mean, he starts off in the story, and he's taking his role as king very seriously. He doesn't want to tolerate any kind of wrongdoing. He doesn't want to put up with any sort of rebellion or sin in his kingdom. It's good David is sort of solid on that, but it's good that he learns to just kind of go easy as the story goes on. You know, we could look at it and say, well, yeah, David, when he hears it from a different perspective, it's very nice that David learns this lesson about being kind to people who have messed up. It occurs to me we want a God like that too, don't we? I mean, we love the idea of a God who looks down on us and says, well, I know you're trying hard. You're not perfect, but you're giving it the old college try. That's good for you, right? And I'm happy with that. Just do your best. The idea of a God who says, I take sin very, very seriously. We sort of, by nature, I think we just sort of pull back from that a little bit. We'd rather have the God who's big on mercy and not so concerned about justice. We want a God who shows a lot of love, a lot of compassion. But the idea of a God that gets angry about sin, not so much. We want the mercy, and we really aren't so big on justice, unless it's justice for someone else, right? Mercy and justice. But the question is this. When God looks at us, can he really look the other way? Can a perfect and holy and righteous God look at us down to the depths of our being and just sort of shrug his shoulders and tell us, well, try a little harder next time? He can't do that without compromising his character. He can't do that without somehow becoming less holy or less perfect or less righteous. See, God is a God of perfection in every way, a God of holiness, and a holy God must be a just God. And a holy and just God must take sin seriously. So the question is, what will it take for a holy and righteous God to bring his children home again? What will it take for God to bring us back to the palace, as it were? The king has to deal justly with our sin. God has to deal justly with our sin. And that's exactly what God does in Jesus. You see, it's in Jesus that justice and mercy come together perfectly. It's at the cross where justice and mercy meet. It's at the cross that Jesus receives the kiss of betrayal, so that we might receive the embrace of the Father. It's at the cross where Jesus receives the rod of God's justice so that we might receive His mercy. It's at the cross where Jesus is estranged from His Father so that we might be adopted in as children. It's at the cross where